The first snow of November 1874 had barely dusted the rooftops of Caldwell, Kansas, when Letitia Reed walked across the frost-hardened yard to a house that did not belong to her and lit a fire in a stove that had gone cold for 2 years. She did not do it for any reward. She did not do it because anyone had asked her. She did it because she had known Thomas Monroe since she was 19 years old and he was 23. Since before her husband Jacob Reed had brought her west on a wagon that smelled of pine resin and canvas. Since before Jacob had coughed his last breath into a pillow, while the prairie wind howled outside their bedroom window. She lit the fire because Thomas Monroe was somewhere out in the world, somewhere between here and the cattle trails of Texas and the high passes of Colorado. And she believed with a certainty she could not fully explain that a man ought to come home to a warm house. The town of Caldwell sat on the edge of Indian Territory, a rough and restless place where cattle drivers came through in the spring and summer, where the smell of dust and manure and wood smoke all mixed together until you could not tell one from another. It was the kind of town that swallowed whole men who went south with herds and did not come back, men who drank away their wages in the 2 saloons on the main street, men who picked fights over card games and ended up buried in the cemetery on the hill before their boots wore out. It was not a gentle place, but Letitia Reed had made it her home because Jacob had died here and because she was not a woman who ran from things. She was 28 years old in that November of 1874, with brown hair that she kept pinned at the back of her neck and gray eyes that her mother had once said could read the weather better than any almanac. She was lean and capable in the way that frontier women became lean and capable, not from vanity but from necessity, from chopping wood and hauling water and stretching a little flour and a little lard as far as they would go. Jacob had left her the house and a small amount of money and a mule named Porter, and she had made those things last with the kind of quiet determination that her neighbors respected without always understanding. Thomas Monroe's house sat 2 properties to the west of hers, separated by a stretch of open ground where a fence had once stood before a storm knocked it down. It was a good solid house, better built than most in Caldwell, because Thomas had spent 3 full summers constructing it before the cattle work pulled him away. He had laid every stone of the foundation himself, had mortised every joint in the door frames with the particular care of a man who believed that a house ought to outlast the man who built it. He had no family left in Kansas. His mother had died of fever in the spring of 1872, and his father had gone before that, and a younger sister had married and moved to Missouri. Thomas Monroe was alone in a way that Letitia understood from the inside, and that understanding was part of why she felt the fire in his stove was her responsibility when no one else would see to it. The first winter she did it, she told herself she was just being practical. An empty house that got too cold would have its pipes freeze if it had been built with pipes, which Thomas's had not, but the walls would contract, and the wood would crack and the whole structure would suffer. That was what she told herself. She went over every other morning, unlocked the door with the spare key Thomas had left with old Hector Birch at the hardware store, and which Hector had handed to Letitia without ceremony when she asked, because nobody in Caldwell questioned Letitia Reed's practicality, and she fed the stove enough wood to keep the house from going entirely cold. She swept the floors when they needed sweeping. She checked the windows for broken panes. She did not touch his personal belongings, did not move the book stacked on the table by the window or the leather-bound journal he had left on the shelf above the stove, did not rearrange the tin cup and the shaving blade he had left beside the wash basin as if he had only stepped out for the morning. But she sat sometimes, when the fire was going well, and the light came through the south window in the pale winter way that made everything look quieter than it was, and she thought about Thomas Monroe. She thought about the way he laughed, which was a slow thing, building from somewhere deep in his chest before it reached his face. She thought about the evening before he had ridden south 2 years ago, when he had come to her door Jacob had been dead 8 months by then, and had stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and told her that he had taken a contract driving cattle up from Texas for the Whitfield outfit, that the money was too good to pass up, that he would be back before the following summer. He had looked at her for a long moment before he put his hat back on, and she had thought he was going to say something else, something that lived behind his eyes and had not yet found its way out, but he had only said good night and walked back through the dark to his house. He had not come back before the following summer. He had sent a letter in July saying the drive had been delayed, that there was trouble with water along the Kishom Trail, that he had signed on for a second drive to make up the distance. He had sent another letter in November, from somewhere in Colorado, saying that he had found work for the winter with a ranching operation near Pueblo, and that he would return in the spring. Spring came and went, and there was no Thomas Monroe. Only another letter saying the ranching work had extended, that there had been a hard winter and they needed every hand. Then a whole year had passed without a letter, and people in Caldwell had begun to speak of Thomas Monroe in the past tense the way they spoke of men who were swallowed by the country. Letitia did not speak of him in the past tense. She kept his stove burning. The second winter was the one that tested her. November of 1875 arrived with a fury, an early blizzard that swept down from the north and buried Caldwell under 2 feet of snow in a single day and a half. Porter, the mule, refused to leave the barn. Letitia's own stove required 3 times its usual ration of wood just to keep the kitchen from freezing, and her woodpile was shorter than she would have liked because she had been sharing with old widow Macready on the far side of her property, a woman of 70 who could not swing an axe anymore. But Letitia went to Thomas Monroe's house anyway, twice a week that whole black winter, trudging through the snow with her coat wrapped around her and a scarf over her face, and she kept his fire going. Her neighbor, Dora Finch, caught her at it in January of 1876, coming across the yard in the early morning when the cold was sharp enough to make your eyes water. Dora said, stopping at the edge of the property line with her shawl pulled tight. He has been gone 2 years, maybe more. You cannot know if he is coming back. Letitia paused at Thomas Monroe's door with the key in her hand. She did not turn around right away. She looked at the door, at the good solid oak of it, at the iron latch Thomas had shaped himself at the forge that had once stood behind Hector Birch's hardware store. No, Letitia said, I cannot know. Then why do you keep going in there? She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, not just reaching for an easy answer. Because if he does come back, she said finally, he will come back cold. And a man ought to come home to a warm house. Dora Finch shook her head in the way that people shook their heads at things that moved them without quite making sense to them, and went back across the yard, and Letitia unlocked the door and went inside. The house smelled of him still, or she imagined it did, that particular combination of wood shavings and pipe tobacco and something clean and indefinable that she associated with Thomas Monroe and with no one else. She built the fire with careful hands and sat for a while beside the stove and let herself think what she usually did not let herself think in full daylight, that she had been in love with Thomas Monroe for a very long time, longer perhaps than she had been willing to admit even to herself, and that this was why she came here, that the practical explanations were true enough but they were not the whole truth. She had loved Jacob Reed. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. Jacob had been a good man, kind and steady, and she had grieved him honestly when he died. But she had been 19 when she married him, and the years had taught her things about herself that she had not known at 19. And one of the things she had learned was that what she felt for Thomas Monroe had a different quality to it, something that worked its way up from deeper ground, something that had been growing in her long before she had a name for it. She stood up, straightened her skirt, banked the fire so it would hold for the next day, and walked home through the snow. March came, and then April, and the snow turned to mud, and the mud dried to dust, and the prairie greened up the way it always did, with a suddenness that still surprised her after 7 years in Kansas, all that brown land going green nearly overnight as if it had been waiting for permission. The cattle drivers began coming through Caldwell again, lean and sunburned men from Texas, who filled up the saloons and the hotel on the main street and spent their pay with the particular recklessness of men who had been weeks on the trail without anything to spend it on. Letitia ran a small business by then, selling preserves and bread and the occasional pie to the hotel cook, and the traffic in town was good for business, and she kept herself busy enough that she did not have a great deal of time to think about Thomas Monroe during the daylight hours. But she had a habit now, going to his house, and she kept it through the spring and summer, checking the windows, sweeping the floors, keeping the small kitchen garden he had started behind the house from going entirely to weeds. She told herself this was still about preserving the property. She planted tomatoes in his garden in May because the bed was already there, and it would have been wasteful not to. She watered them through the dry July and harvested them in August and put them up in jars that she stacked neatly on his kitchen shelf, thinking that, when he came home, he would have food already waiting, and she was aware that she was making herself comfortable with the idea of his homecoming in a way that was beginning to feel less like hope and more like faith. It was the last week of October 1876 when Thomas Monroe came home. She did not see him arrive. She was in her own kitchen that afternoon, kneading bread dough with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, when she heard a horse on the road and then no horse, and then silence, and she thought nothing of it. There were always horses on the road. Caldwell was a busy town. She finished the bread and shaped it into loaves and put it in the oven and went about her other work, and it was not until she stepped out onto her porch in the early evening to watch the sun go down, a habit she had kept from the first year she arrived in Kansas, because the western sunsets over the flat prairie were one of the things that made the hardness of the place bearable, that she saw the light in Thomas Monroe's window. She stood very still on her porch for a long moment. It was not the light from the stove that she had lit herself that morning. It was a different kind of light, lamplight, moving through the house, and there was smoke coming from the chimney that was thicker and more purposeful than the banked fire smoke she would have left. She stood very still and felt something move through her that she did not have a name for, something that started in the center of her chest and spread outward until she felt it in her hands. She took off her apron. She looked down at herself, her work dress, her sleeves still rolled up, her hair coming loose from its pins after a day of work. She rolled her sleeves down and fastened the cuffs and did not bother with the hair and walked across the open ground between the properties. She knocked on the door of Thomas Monroe's house. There was a silence, and then footsteps, and then the door opened. He was thinner than she remembered. His face had more weather in it, more lines at the corners of his eyes, a beard he had not had before that was dark with a little gray in it, though he was only 30 years old. He was tall in the doorway, filling it the way he always had, and he was holding a lamp in one hand and looking at her with an expression that went through several things very quickly: surprise, recognition, relief, something else that took longer to name. "Letitia," he said. "Thomas," she said. They stood looking at each other across the threshold in 2.5 years of absence. "I just got in," he said. "I was going to come over in the morning. I did not want to disturb you at this hour." "You would not have disturbed me," she said. He looked past her at the dark yard, at the thin sliver of moon above the prairie, and then back at her. "Come in," he said, and stepped back from the door. The kitchen was warm. Her fire from the morning had been going all day, and he had built it up when he arrived. And the room was warm in a way that stopped her just inside the door, that particular warmth of a place that had been well tended. She looked at the stove and then at the shelf above it where she had stacked the jars of tomatoes she had put up in August, a dozen of them in a neat row, and then she looked at Thomas Monroe's face as he looked at the same shelf. "The garden produced well this year," she said. "I used your beds. I hope that is all right." He did not say anything for a moment. He set the lamp down on the table and looked at the kitchen, at the clean floor, at the stacked jars, at the stove burning steady and warm. And then he looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, but that made something tighten in her throat. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Since the first winter you were gone," she said. "I kept the stove going. I did not want the house to suffer." "That was 2.5 years ago," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. He moved to the stove and held his hands out toward it, and she could see that he was cold from the road that he had been riding all day, that there was trailed dust on his coat and boots. He stared at the fire inside the stove through the small vent in the iron door, and she watched his back, watched the tension in his shoulders. Then he turned around and looked at her directly, and he said, "How did you know I was coming back?" The question landed in the warm kitchen air between them, and she felt it all the way through her. She could have said something practical. She could have talked about the house, about the property, about simple neighborly care. She could have deflected the way she sometimes deflected when things got too close to the truth she had been carrying around for years. But she looked at Thomas Monroe standing in his own kitchen with the firelight on his face, thinner and more weathered than he had been but entirely himself, and she said, "I did not know, I only believed it. Those are not the same thing." He took a step toward her and she did not step back. "You believed it," he said very quietly. "Every single winter," she said. He stood close enough that she could see the lines the years had put at the corners of his eyes and the particular dark intensity that had always been in his gaze when he looked at her, that quality she had noticed for years without allowing herself to act on it. He raised his right hand and touched her face just briefly, his fingertips at her cheekbone in a gesture so careful it made her breath come short. "Letitia," he said, and then he stopped. "Say it," she said. "Whatever it is, say it. I thought about you," he said, "the whole time I was gone. Every drive, every winter camp, every night in a bunkhouse in Colorado with the wind coming through the walls. I thought about you, and I did not have the right to because I had never said anything. I had never told you." He paused. "I should have told you before I left. I have been wanting to tell you since before Jacob died, and then he did die, and it felt wrong to say it, and then I left, and it has been wrong not to say it ever since." She put her hand over his, the hand that had touched her face, and held it there. "Then say it now," she said. "I love you," Thomas Monroe said, in the direct and unadorned way that he did everything, standing in his own warm kitchen with the fire she had built still burning, looking at her as if she were the only fixed point in a country that moved constantly around him. "I have loved you for a long time, and I am sorry it took me this long and this many miles to say so." Letitia Reed had kept a great deal of feeling carefully contained for a great many years, because the frontier did not leave much room for feeling things loudly, and because she was a woman who had learned to carry things quietly. But standing in that kitchen in the October evening with the warmth of the stove around her and Thomas Monroe's hand under hers, she let some of it come up to the surface. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you long enough that I am almost embarrassed to say how long." He made a sound that was the beginning of that slow laugh she had always loved, the one that built from his chest, and then it became a full laugh, and then he put both his arms around her and held her in the warm kitchen, and she put her face against the front of his coat and breathed in the smell of him, trail dust and cold air and the particular warmth of him underneath, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. They stood like that for what felt like a long time. The fire in the stove popped and settled. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie in the way it always did at night in the fall, a long, steady sound that she had stopped noticing years ago, except on nights like this when she paid attention. Eventually she stepped back and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and they were both smiling in the slightly disbelieving way of people who have wanted something for a long time and are not yet entirely used to having it. "You need to eat," she said, because she was a practical woman, and because it was true. "I have bread in the oven across the yard. Come have supper." "I would like that very much," Thomas Monroe said. She brought him back across the dark yard and through her kitchen door, and she fed him bread, and the remains of a rabbit stew she had made at noon, and he ate with the focused gratitude of a man who had been on the trail for weeks and had not had a home-cooked meal in a very long time. He told her about the years he had been away, unhurriedly, the way he talked, and she listened and asked questions, and felt the particular pleasure of learning the shape of someone's time when you had only had their absence before. He had done 3 cattle drives up from Texas, the last 2 for a man named Whitfield, and the third for an outfit out of San Antonio called the Garza Brothers, which was one of the few drives that season run by Mexican cattlemen, and which had taught him more Spanish than he had expected to learn in Kansas. He had spent 2 winters near Pueblo working a cattle ranch for a man named Everett Cross, who was fair and difficult in roughly equal measure. He had been injured in the second winter, a horse that had spooked and thrown him badly enough that his left arm had been out of use for 6 weeks, which was why there had been no letter that winter. He had not been able to write and had been too proud to dictate. "You should have found someone to write for you," Letitia said. "I know it," Thomas said. "I was not thinking clearly." "I thought you were dead," she said, and the plainness of it, the weight of those 4 words, made him set down his fork and look at her. "I am sorry," he said, "truly sorry." "The whole town was talking about you in the past tense," she said. "There is a woman named Dora Finch next door who told me in January of that year that I needed to accept the fact that you were not coming back. What did you say to her?" "I told her I was keeping your stove lit regardless," Letitia said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" She met his eyes across the table. "Because I knew what kind of man you were, and men like you come back." That was the evening that everything changed, though the changing had been a long time building, like a house that seems to go up slowly until suddenly the roof is on and it is standing whole, and you wonder how it happened so fast. Thomas Monroe slept in his own house that night. Of course he did. The town would have had enough to say without that particular talk. But he came to her door the next morning at the same time she was going to his, and they very nearly collided on the path between the properties and laughed about it. And that was the shape of the thing from then on. He spent the next 3 weeks settling back into Caldwell. There were practical matters to attend to. His house needed more winter preparation than she had been able to do alone. There was a section of the roof that had sagged and needed reinforcing. The corral behind the house wanted new boards in several places. He threw himself into the work with a purposefulness that she recognized as his particular response to having been away for too long from things that were his. She brought him meals and worked alongside him when the work was the kind that went faster with 2 pairs of hands, and they talked while they worked, more talking than she had done with anyone in years, because Thomas Monroe was a man who listened as well as he spoke, which was rarer than it ought to have been. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Caldwell was not a large place, and there was not much that happened on its streets and properties that did not become common knowledge by the end of the week. Dora Finch came to Letitia's door with a pie and a significant expression that Letitia deflected with genuine warmth, because she liked Dora even when Dora was being obvious. Old Hector Birch winked at Thomas when he came into the hardware store for nails, which Thomas ignored with the self-possession of a man who had been the subject of other people's attention before, and did not find it particularly troubling. The Reverend, a man named Aldous Webb who had come to Caldwell 3 years earlier, and who was decent enough if somewhat formal in his manner, called on Letitia one afternoon and sat in her front room and made a speech about propriety and community standards that Letitia listened to with perfect patience, before telling him that she and Thomas Monroe were adults who had done nothing improper, and that she was confident the Almighty had larger matters to attend to than the walking distance between their respective kitchens. Reverend Webb left somewhat flustered but not entirely displeased, because Letitia Reed's competence and straight dealing were things he respected even when they were directed at him. It was Hector Birch who finally said the thing that was on everyone's mind, not with a wink this time but directly, man to man, one Saturday afternoon in November when Thomas was at the store and the other customers had gone. You planning on making your intentions formal?" Hector asked, in the tone of a man who had watched a great deal of life from behind a hardware counter and had formed considered opinions about most of it. Because a woman like Letitia Reed deserves a man who makes his intentions clear. She has been alone a long time and she has not complained about it, but that does not mean it has been easy. Thomas Monroe put down the box of nails he had been examining and looked at Hector Birch for a moment. "I have every intention of making my intentions formal," he said. "I just want to do it properly." Hector nodded with satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Then get the nails and go do it properly." What doing it properly meant to Thomas Monroe, Letitia discovered, involved first having a conversation with her. Not a formal request, not a speech from a bent knee, though that came later, but a genuine conversation, which was very like him, because Thomas Monroe believed that the significant decisions of life ought to be made with both parties present and both parties talking. He came to her house on a Sunday afternoon in late November after the morning service, when the light was already going thin and gray over the prairie, and the temperature had dropped since noon. He came into her kitchen and stood for a moment looking at her, and she looked back at him, and she could see that he was not nervous exactly, but that he was being careful with something, the way he was careful with things he valued. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but first I want to ask you if you want to be asked." Letitia set down the book she had been reading and looked at him properly. "That is a very unusual approach," she said. "I know it," he said, "but you have been making your own decisions for a long time and doing it well, and I do not want to assume. If you are happy as you are, I want to know that too." She stood up and crossed the kitchen to where he was standing and looked up at him, and she said, "Thomas Monroe, I kept your stove burning for 2.5 years because I was in love with you. Ask me the question." He asked her the question. She said yes. He kissed her in the thin gray November light of her kitchen, carefully at first and then less carefully, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms and thought that she had been a patient woman for a very long time and that the waiting had been worth it. They were married in the second week of December 1876 in the small church at the center of Caldwell, with a congregation that included essentially everyone in town, because nothing of this magnitude was ever a small event in a place this size. Dora Finch cried, which she had predicted she would do, and which she was entirely unashamed of. Hector Birch sat in the front row with his wife Martha, and looked like a man whose advice had been acted upon to good effect. Reverend Aldous Webb performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he had made his peace with the situation and perhaps had even been pleased by it, which Letitia suspected he had. She wore the best dress she owned, a dark blue wool that she had made herself 2 winters ago, and which had never until now had an occasion worthy of it. Thomas Monroe wore his good coat, which she had helped him brush clean of the remaining trail dust 2 nights earlier, and he looked at her when she came down the church aisle with an expression that made her feel the way the first spring day always made her feel, that sudden lifting that was the opposite of the weight she had grown accustomed to carrying. The words they said to each other in Reverend Webb's careful phrasing were words that had been said in that church and others like it many times, but Letitia felt the weight of each one specifically, the particular meaning of promising herself to Thomas Monroe in the presence of people who had watched both of them survive the things they had survived. When he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, and that had arrived by the previous week's mail, her hands were entirely steady, which she had not expected, and which told her something about the quality of the certainty she felt. They had supper that evening at the hotel, which Hector Birch's wife Martha had quietly organized as a gift to them, a proper meal with a white tablecloth and the best the hotel kitchen could produce, which was better than most people in Caldwell gave it credit for. The Finches and the Birches and a handful of other neighbors joined them, and it was a warm and noisy and good evening, The kind of evening that Letitia had not let herself imagine having for a long time, and which felt almost unreal in its pleasantness. Later, when the guests had gone and the town had gone quiet with the particular silence of a winter night in Kansas, she stood in Thomas Monroe's house, her house now too. They had decided she would move her things the following week, and looked at the stove she had kept burning for 2.5 years. "Still going," she said. Thomas came to stand behind her and put his arms around her, his chin against her hair. "Never went out," he said. "It went out many times," she said. "I had to relight it every time." "Then it never stayed out," he said. "That is the same thing." She turned in his arms and looked at him. "Is it?" "I think so," he said. "I think the important thing is that you kept coming back to light it." She kept his name, legally speaking, but she kept her own name too, the way some women in that time and place did not, because Letitia Reed Monroe was who she was, and Thomas did not ask her to become otherwise. He asked her in the early weeks of their marriage what she wanted the shape of their life together to look like, and she told him, and he told her what he wanted, and they built the shape of it together the way he had built his house, carefully, with attention to the joints, with the intention that it should stand. The first practical question was the matter of the two houses. They decided to live in Thomas's, which was better built and had more room, and to rent Letitia's house to a young couple named Cole and Annabeth Dawes, who had come through Caldwell in March of the following year and needed somewhere to live. Cole Dawes was a blacksmith who had come west looking for work, and he found it in Caldwell easily enough because the cattle traffic meant a constant demand for horseshoes and harness fittings, and all the metal work that kept a cow town running. They were young. Cole was 22 and Annabeth was 19, and they were good tenants, careful with the house and grateful for the fair rent that Thomas and Letitia charged them, and in time they became friends. The second practical question was what Thomas Monroe was going to do with himself in Caldwell. He had a good deal of money saved from the years on the trail, more than most men came back with, because he had never had much to spend it on, and had never had the gambling habit that emptied a great many cowboys' pockets before they were cold. He had thought, riding back from Colorado, about what he wanted to do, and what he had arrived at was a general merchandise business, something more substantial than Hector Birch's hardware store, but in a different direction. A store that carried the kinds of goods that families needed as more families came west, which they were doing in increasing numbers as the railroad continued pushing its iron lines across the prairie. He talked it over with Letitia for several evenings at the kitchen table, spreading out the numbers in the direct way he thought about money, and she listened and asked questions, and then said what she thought, which was that the idea was sound, and that his timing was good, and that she had a suggestion about the inventory that he had not considered, which was that a line of preserved foods, high-quality preserved foods better than what the general stores in town were carrying, would sell well to the trail drivers and the homesteading families alike. She had been preserving foods and selling them for 3 years, and she knew the demand. He looked at her across the table with an expression that she was beginning to know well, that particular expression that meant he was integrating new information and finding it good, and he said that was an excellent idea and that they should do it together. Monroe's Mercantile opened in April of 1877, in a building that Thomas had purchased at the east end of the main street, and spent the winter rebuilding to his specifications, with wide shelves along all 4 walls and a good wide-planked floor and windows on 2 sides that let in the morning light. Letitia ran the preserved food section, which occupied 1 full wall and which became, within the first cattle season, one of the most talked-about features of the store drivers coming up from Texas and buying jars of her preserved tomatoes and peaches and pickled vegetables to take back south, homesteading women coming in and buying her jams, and looking at the quality of her seals with the professional respect of other women who knew what good preserving work looked like. Thomas handled the dry goods and the hardware items and the feed, and they worked together in the store through the day and came home together in the evening, and it suited them both in a way that they had each, separately, stopped believing anything would suit them. The spring of 1877 was a good season. The cattle drives came through heavy, more traffic than the previous 2 years, the town full of noise and money, and the particular chaotic energy of men who had been on the trail for weeks and were ready to be somewhere that had walls and a roof and something other than beans and jerked beef to eat. Thomas knew several of the trail bosses from his own driving days, and those connections were good for business. Men who remembered Thomas Monroe as reliable and straight-dealing finding their way to his store as a natural extension of that memory. Letitia watched him work with those men, and saw a version of him she had not seen before, relaxed in the particular way of men who are in a world they know, easy with the language and the references, part of something that had its own codes and customs. She liked seeing it. She liked learning this part of him. There was one evening in May of that first spring when a man came into the store just before closing, a man named Garrett Hollies, who had been the trail boss on the last drive Thomas had worked before coming home. He was a big man, loud in the way some men were loud as a form of claiming space, and he came in looking for Thomas with the manner of someone who had an old score to settle about something. Letitia had met men like Garrett Hollies before, and she watched him carefully. The matter, it turned out, was a disagreement about wages from the final drive, Hollies claiming that Thomas had been paid more than his due by some error in the accounting. Thomas listened to the complaint with the patience he brought to difficult things and then disputed it calmly and clearly, the numbers laid out without heat, the logic of them unavoidable. Hollies pushed for a while, the way some men pushed, and Thomas did not yield and did not raise his voice, and eventually Hollies left without what he had come for. "Does that happen often?" Letitia asked after the door had closed. "Often enough," Thomas said, without particular concern. "Men remember what they want to remember about money." She thought about this. "Does it trouble you that he might cause a problem in town?" "Hollies is loud and not honest," Thomas said. "People who work with him long enough know it. He will move on to the next drive in a few days. I am not worried." He was right, as it turned out. Hollies moved on. The matter dissolved the way minor troubles dissolved in a cow town, swallowed by the next wave of activity and noise and money. The summer of 1877 was the summer Letitia discovered she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Thomas, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted a little time with it herself first. This enormous and private fact that had not yet become a shared fact. She thought about what it meant in the practical sense and the emotional sense, and the way those two senses were difficult to separate when you were talking about a child. And she thought about her own mother, who had died when Letitia was 14, and about Jacob, who would never know this child, and about Thomas, who would, who was here and present, and who she loved with a certainty that she was no longer surprised by. She told him on a Thursday evening in late June, sitting on the porch after supper when the heat was finally beginning to ease, and the sky in the west was going red and orange over the flat land. She told him plainly, the way she told him things, and he was quiet for a long moment in the way he was quiet when something moved him deeply. Then he looked at her, and she saw everything she needed to see in his face: joy and fear and love, all three at once, which was honest, which was the right response, and he reached across and took her hand and held it and said very quietly, "Thank you." She laughed a little at that, surprised. "I did not do it alone," she said. "I know it," he said. "But thank you all the same." They told the Birches and the Finches and the Dawseys, and the news went through Caldwell the way news did, and people were pleased in the way that a community is pleased by new life, which is partly generosity and partly the particular comfort of watching the cycle of things continue. Martha Birch arrived with a quilt she had been piecing together for 2 years, which she now announced had always been meant for this child specifically, which no one believed but which everyone appreciated as a gracious reframing of events. Thomas rebuilt the smaller bedroom that winter, expanding it and adding a south-facing window that would catch the light all morning, working on it in the evenings after the store closed and on Sunday afternoons. Letitia sat in the doorway sometimes and watched him work, watched the careful way he moved the lumber and fitted the pieces, and thought about the house he had built when he was young, the house she had kept for him when he was gone, and the way that house was now full in a way it had never been. The child was born in February of 1878, a boy, in the bedroom of the house while the snow came down outside, and the wind moved across the prairie, and Thomas sat beside the bed holding Letitia's hand until Dora Finch, who had sufficient experience with childbirth to be the nearest thing Caldwell had to a midwife, told him to step out of the way and let her work. He went to the kitchen and stood by the stove and was very still for a long time, listening. And then the baby's cry came through the door, and he let out a breath he had not known he had been holding. They named him James Jacob Monroe, James for Thomas's father, Jacob for Letitia's late husband, because Letitia wanted the name in the world still, wanted the goodness of Jacob Reed to be carried forward by something. Thomas agreed without hesitation, which was one of the things she loved about him, his lack of smallness in situations where some men would have been small. James Jacob Monroe was a substantial baby with a loud voice and a great deal of dark hair, and he was, from the first day, the most interesting thing in the house. Thomas held him with the careful intensity of a man who had not held many babies and was aware of the responsibility, and looked at his son's face with an expression that Letitia wished she could have painted or photographed, that particular expression of a person encountering something that exceeds what they had prepared themselves for. The years that followed settled into a rhythm that Letitia had never believed she would find, and which she valued precisely because she had gone so long without it. The store grew. The town grew. The cattle trade was heavy through the late 1870s, and then began to shift as the railroad moved and the trail routes changed. But Monroe's mercantile adapted because Thomas was a practical man who paid attention to how things were changing, and Letitia's preserved foods business had by then grown far beyond what she could do alone in a single kitchen. She hired 2 women to help her, Annabeth Dawes, who had proved to be an excellent preserver, and a Cherokee woman named Clara Bird, who had married a Caldwell farrier, and who brought techniques and flavors to the preserved foods that Letitia had never encountered before, and which became some of the most popular items in the store. Clara Bird's presence in the store was not welcomed by everyone. There were people in Caldwell, and in any town like it, in that time and place, who carried prejudices so old and so settled into their thinking that they were barely aware of them as prejudices at all, who spoke of the native people of the territory with a contempt that was all the more ugly for being casual, as if cruelty were simply a matter of fact rather than a choice. Letitia had encountered this ugliness before, and she disliked it in the direct way she disliked things that were wrong. She told Thomas, the first week Clara worked in the store, that anyone who had a problem with Clara Bird working there was welcome to take their business elsewhere, and she told Clara Bird the same thing, and she meant both. There were 2 or 3 men who tested this policy in small ways over the following weeks, slights, remarks, the particular way some men had of not quite looking at a person they wanted to diminish. Letitia handled each instance directly, without drama but without compromise, and Thomas backed her up without being asked. And eventually the matter settled itself the way matters settle when the people holding the line do not move. Clara Bird, for her part, was a woman of considerable self-possession who did not require Letitia's protection from those men's opinions, but who appreciated. She said one afternoon when they were working together on a batch of peach preserves, that the protection was offered anyway. Most white women in this town would not say what you said, Clara told her, stirring the pot with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. Most people do not say enough of what they mean, Letitia replied, and Clara Bird smiled, and the friendship that had been forming between them since Clara came to work in the store moved to a different level. James Monroe grew from a baby into a boy with his father's height coming in early, and his mother's gray eyes, and a curiosity about everything that was charming at 2 years old and somewhat exhausting at 4. He followed Thomas around the store in a way that made customers smile, reaching for things on the lower shelves and handing them to his father with great seriousness. And he followed Letitia into the kitchen at home in the same way, standing on a stool beside her at the work table and watching her hands and asking questions without stopping, until she put something small but manageable in his hands and let him help. He was a social child, at ease with everyone from the trail-hardened cattlemen who came through the store to old Hector Birch to Clara Bird, who taught him several words of Cherokee that he repeated to his father with the pride of a child who has learned a secret language. The winter of 1879 was the third winter since Thomas had come home, and Letitia found herself in a strange but pleasant nostalgic mood as the first cold settled over Caldwell. She was standing at the window of the kitchen one morning in early November, watching the frost on the grass of the yard, James playing near the stove with a set of wooden blocks Thomas had carved for him over the summer, when Thomas came up behind her and looked out the same window. "Thinking about something," he said. "The winters," she said, "when you were gone." He was quiet for a moment. He put his arm around her and she leaned back against him. "I am sorry I was gone so long," he said. It was not the first time he had said it, but he said it as if it still meant something to him to say, which she appreciated. "I kept the stove burning," she said. "You did," he said. "And when I came back it was warm." She turned and looked up at him. "Do you know what I thought about those mornings when I went over there? Tell me." "I thought about you coming in from the cold," she said, "coming through the door after a long trip, cold and tired. I wanted you to have something warm to come back to. I thought about it so many times that it was almost real to me before it actually happened." He looked at her for a long moment. "And when it actually happened?" "It was better," she said, "better than I had imagined it." He kissed her in the kitchen with James obliviously stacking blocks beside the stove, and the winter light coming in flat and pale through the window. And she thought that this was what it felt like to have the thing you had imagined through a long, cold stretch of time turn out to be real and solid and warm in your hands. The spring of 1880 brought a new development that neither of them had entirely expected, though perhaps they should have. Letitia found herself expecting again. James was 3 years old by then, a sturdy 3. And the prospect of another child was met with the particular mix of joy and pragmatic calculation that characterized how Thomas and Letitia approached most things. They would need more help in the store if she was going to be limited in the later months. They would need to think about the bedroom situation. They had enough financially, more than enough. The store was doing well. These practical considerations were real and they attended to them. But the deeper thing, the thing that was not practical at all but was simply the feeling of it, was joy. That was the word she kept arriving at. She had not been sure, after Jacob died, that she would know joy again in this particular way, the wide open plainness of it, and here it was. The second child was born in October 1880, another boy, which surprised them both a little and delighted James enormously, because he had been hoping for a brother with a specificity that was funny to observe. They named him William Thomas Monroe, and he was from the first moment quieter than James, more watchful, a baby who looked around at the world with the considering expression of someone taking careful inventory. He had Thomas's coloring and Thomas's build from the beginning, broad-shouldered even as an infant in the way that some people are somehow present in their children from the first day. The year 1880 was also the year that the railroad came closer to Caldwell than it had been, which changed the town in ways both welcome and complicated. More people, more commerce, more opportunity, these were the welcome changes. More noise, more strangers, more pressure on the land, and the people who had been there before the rail brought its iron ambitions west. These were the complicated ones. Thomas watched the changes with the measured attention he brought to things he was not sure about, and Letitia watched them with the slightly sharper attention of a woman who had been thinking about consequences, since before consequences came. They had a conversation one evening that fall, after the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, about what they wanted for their family and for the business and for the life they were building. It was the kind of conversation that couples have when they can see that things are changing around them and they want to be deliberate about what they hold on to. They talked for a long time about expanding the store versus staying at its current size, about whether James should learn his letters from Letitia at home for now or whether the town school, which had just opened, was the better choice, about the question of the house and whether the 2 bedrooms were going to be enough for much longer. By the end of the conversation, they had made several decisions. The store would expand, but carefully, one section at a time rather than all at once. James would go to the town school in the spring, because Letitia's schooling was good, but so was the company of other children. The house needed another room, which Thomas would build in the summer, because 2 boys sharing a room was manageable for now but not forever. And they would, when William was old enough that Letitia could step away from the store more easily, make a trip somewhere that was not Caldwell, somewhere with more green and more water. A vacation of a kind they had never taken, just the 2 of them or the 4 of them if the boys were old enough, because they had both worked hard for a long time, and there was value in going somewhere else long enough to see what you had built from a little distance. Thomas built the new room in the summer of 1881, as promised, expanding the back of the house with the same careful attention he had brought to the original structure, and Letitia helped him when the work wanted 2 pairs of hands and watched him work from the kitchen door when it did not. She liked watching him work. She had always liked it, the purposefulness of it, the way he moved with the clean economy of a man who had been working with his hands since he was young and did not waste effort. James helped too, or believed he was helping, carrying nails and boards in the way small boys helped, with great enthusiasm and variable usefulness, and William watched from a blanket in the shade with the patient observation that was becoming his characteristic mode. Hector Birch died in the fall of 1881, quietly in his sleep one October night, at a good age for that time and place, which was 67 years old. It was a loss that Caldwell felt genuinely, because Hector had been in the hardware store since before most of the current residents had arrived, a fixed point in the geography of the town, and his particular combination of directness and decency had been one of the better things about living there. Thomas gave the eulogy, which was short and honest and very like Hector himself, and Martha Birch, who was made of harder material than most people knew, stood through the service with the composed grief of a woman who had expected this, and had not let the expectation make her love him any less. Letitia and Thomas had Hector's grave marked with a stone that Thomas cut himself, because Hector had sold Thomas the nails for his house and had given him useful advice about several significant matters, and it seemed right that the stone be made by hand. It was a good stone, solid and plain, which was right. Martha Birch, widowed now, began spending more time at the store, which became a kind of informal meeting place for the women of Caldwell in the afternoon hours when the cattle traffic slowed down and the light turned golden over the main street. Dora Finch came, and Clara Bird, and Annabeth Dawes, and several others, women who brought mending and sat and talked while Letitia kept the shop, and William played on the floor and James came in from school with his shoes muddy and his pockets full of whatever he had collected that day, rocks, feathers, interesting pieces of wood, on one memorable occasion, a small and entirely unharmed frog. These afternoons were a thing Letitia had not anticipated when she was young, this particular quality of female friendship and community that came from proximity and shared work, and the long practice of being in one another's ordinary lives, and she valued them. Thomas valued them too, though from a slightly different angle. He liked coming into the store in the late afternoon and finding it full of women talking, liked the sound of it, the warmth of it, like the evidence that the store had become something more than a commercial operation. He had been alone for a long time before he came home, and he was a man who, now that he was not alone, took the fullness of his life personally, as a thing to be grateful for rather than taken for granted. The winter of 1882 was the first winter in 8 years that Letitia did not think about the stove in Thomas Monroe's house as something she was keeping burning against his possible return, because he was standing beside it every morning and evening, and it had been his stove and hers together for 6 years. But she thought about it sometimes in a different way, as a marker of something, a reminder of the kind of faith that is not certainty but is steadier than certainty in some ways, because it does not depend on proof. She was standing at that stove one morning in December, making porridge for the boys' breakfast, when James, who was 5 now and had been asking questions about everything with a relentlessness that would have been exhausting if it were not also wonderful, looked up from where he was sitting at the table and said, "Mama, Papa says you kept the fire going in this house for a long time before he came back. Is that true?" She turned around and looked at her son, with his dark hair and his gray eyes and the bit of porridge he had already managed to get on his chin, despite the fact that the porridge had not yet been served. "Who told you that?" she said. "Papa told Mr. Birch's widow," James said. "I heard it." Letitia looked through the kitchen door to where Thomas was in the front room getting into his coat to go open the store, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was aware of this conversation and was letting it develop without intervening. "It is true," she said, turning back to the stove and the porridge. "Every winter your father was away, I came to this house and kept the fire going." James considered this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old encountering an adult fact. "Why? Because I wanted him to come home to a warm house," she said. "Did he?" "He did." James nodded, filed this information away in whatever order his mind kept things, and went back to the wooden horse he had been entertaining between questions. Letitia stirred the porridge and felt Thomas come into the kitchen behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. "You heard that," she said. "I heard it," he said. "You told Martha Birch about the stove," she said. "She asked me how we came to be married," he said. It was the most honest answer. She turned around and looked up at him, her husband of 6 years, the man she had kept a stove burning for through 2.5 years of not knowing, the man who had come back from the cold and the distance and the miles of a country that swallowed lesser men and walked through her door and said, "How did you know I was coming back?" "What did you tell her?" Letitia asked. "What did you tell Martha Birch when she asked how we came to be married?" "I told her that I came home and the house was warm," Thomas Monroe said, "and I looked at the woman who had kept it warm for me, and I knew that was the end of going away." She held his gaze for a long moment. The porridge was ready and the boys needed feeding and the store needed opening, all the urgent ordinary claims of a morning. She let them wait a little longer. "It was never the end of going away that I wanted," she said. He looked at her, curious. "I wanted you," she said. "Not just the staying. You. I kept the stove burning because I loved you, not because I wanted you to stop going places, because I wanted you to have somewhere warm to come back to." He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first evening in this kitchen with all of himself in it, nothing held back. "I know the difference," he said quietly, "and I love you for it." He kissed her, and then William called from the other room in the imperious way of a 2-year-old, who wanted his breakfast and was not interested in the sentimental conversation of adults. And James slid off his chair and went to fetch his brother with the responsible elder sibling manner he had recently developed, and which was alternately touching and amusing. And Thomas went to open the store, and Letitia served the porridge. The spring of 1883 came in warm and fast, the prairie greening up in what seemed like an afternoon, the air full of the smell of new grass, and the sound of the meadowlarks that had always been the sound she associated most with this particular stretch of country. The store was doing its best business yet. William was walking now, a solid, purposeful walk that took him toward everything interesting, which in practice meant everything. James had learned to read with a speed that made his teacher at the school, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Fern Tate, write Letitia a note saying that James Monroe was one of the best readers she had taught in 6 years, which Letitia showed to Thomas with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose opinion has been confirmed. It was in April of 1883 that Letitia said the thing that had been forming in her mind since the previous fall. She said it one evening after the boys were asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas over the remnants of supper in the lamplit ordinary comfort of a Tuesday night at home. "I want to visit the ocean," she said. Thomas looked at her with the focused attention that told her he was taking this seriously. "The ocean," he said. "I have never seen it," she said. "I grew up in Missouri and came west, and I have never been east or west enough to see it. I would like to see it. The Pacific. I think we should take the boys and go to California." "That is a long way," he said. "I know it," she said. "But there is a railroad now. We would not need to go by wagon. And we can afford to go, Thomas. We can afford to close the store for 3 weeks and go. Annabeth and Clara can manage the preserved food side while we are gone." He thought about it for a while. She could see him thinking about it, running the practicalities, the cost, the time, the logistics, all the considerations of a man who did not make impractical decisions but who also, she knew now, understood that some decisions were not purely about practicality. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated, not quite believing it had been that easy. "You have been here for 10 years," he said. "You have built a business and kept a house and raised 2 boys and kept a fire burning through winters that would have tested anyone. You want to see the ocean. We will go see the ocean." They went in September of 1883, on the train from Caldwell to Kansas City, and then to San Francisco, a journey that took 6 days and that James discussed with the exhaustive enthusiasm of a boy who had never been on a train and could not get enough of the window and the passing country. William was quieter about it, as William was quieter about most things, but his eyes were wide and clear, and he pressed his small hand against the window when the plains gave way to the mountains, and watched the changing country with the expression of a person witnessing things they will carry a long time. San Francisco was overwhelming in the way that large cities were overwhelming to people who had come from small towns on the prairie, loud and crowded, and full of a variety of human beings that Caldwell had never quite prepared them for. Letitia found it wonderful and exhausting in roughly equal measure. Thomas found it interesting, his natural observation putting names and purposes to the things they saw, the docks and the markets and the steep streets and the hills. The boys found it paradise, James talking to everyone who would talk back, William eating things with a trust in new experiences that he did not yet have words to explain. But it was the ocean that mattered. They went to the shore on their second afternoon, taking a horse-drawn car to where the city ended and the sand began, and they walked down to the water and stood at the edge of the Pacific Ocean on a September afternoon, with the sun coming down into it from the west. Letitia stood at the edge of the water where the waves came up to her feet and looked out at the horizon, at all that water going to the edge of the world, and felt something she had not expected, which was a sense of proportion. 10 years on the flat Kansas prairie had given her a particular sense of distance, horizontal distance, the long miles of grass and sky. But this was different. This was something else. This was the world making itself known as larger than she had been able to keep in her mind all at once. Thomas came to stand beside her. The boys were running at the edge of the surf, James shouting at each wave with the democratic joy of a child who greeted all phenomena on equal terms, William standing very still and letting the water come to his feet and looking at it with great seriousness. "Well," Thomas said. "It is something," Letitia said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the horizon for a long while. She thought about Missouri and the wagon west and Jacob and the years on the prairie, about the first night she had laid a fire in Thomas Monroe's stove, and about the morning he had come back through the door, about James and William and the store and the kitchen and all the ordinary material of a life that was hers and real and good. "I am glad we came," she said. "So am I," he said. She reached for his hand and he took it, and they stood at the edge of the Pacific, with the wind coming off the water and the boys running in the surf, and the sun going down into the ocean in the west. And she thought that this was what the long winters had been waiting to become, that the warmth she had kept burning in the cold and the dark had been building toward this exact moment of light and fullness, and that she had been right to believe, and that the believing had been worth every winter it cost her. They stayed 4 more days in California and then took the train home, because Caldwell was home and had been for 10 years, and the ocean was magnificent, but it was not home. James slept most of the way back, worn out from the adventure. William sat with his head against his father's arm and looked out the window at the mountains and then the plains coming back. And when the flat Kansas grass came into view on the 4th morning of the return journey, he said, "Home," in the clear, certain voice of a 2.5-year-old who knows where he belongs. "Home," Thomas agreed. When they pulled into the station at Caldwell in the early evening, the town looked exactly as they had left it. The main street, the store, the hotel, the church on the edge of town, the smell of dust and grass, and the particular combination of things that meant this place and no other. Letitia stepped down from the train car and stood for a moment looking at it all, the ordinary beloved specificity of it. And then Thomas was beside her with William in his arms and James jumping off the platform steps against all instruction, and they walked home through the town they had made their life in. The house smelled of itself when they walked in the particular combination of the kitchen, and the wood and the years of life lived in those rooms. Thomas lit the lamp and Letitia went to the stove and built the fire up from the banked coals that had been going slowly through the week they were gone, and the kitchen warmed up in the way it always did, quickly and steadily, the particular warmth of a stove that was well made and well tended. Thomas came in from settling the boys, who had fallen asleep before the lamp was fully lit, and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her with the fire. "Still keeping it burning," he said. "Always," she said. "That is my answer to your question. That is how I knew you were coming back, because I decided to keep it burning until you did." He crossed the kitchen and she turned from the stove and he held her face in both hands the way he had that first night in October of 1876, carefully, as if she were something he was still not entirely used to having and did not intend to stop being grateful for. "I am going to keep coming back," he said. "Every time, for as long as there is." "I know you are," she said. "I have always known." They stood in the warm kitchen of the house they had built together, in the town they had made their life in, on the prairie that had tested them both in ways they had not expected and given them things they had not thought to ask for, and the fire in the stove burned steady and strong in the way that fires do when they have been well kept by careful hands. It was the winter of 1884 before Letitia fully stopped keeping track, stopped numbering the winters, stopped holding in some part of herself the posture of waiting. Not because she stopped loving Thomas. She loved him more directly and honestly as the years went on, the way you love things that are real and present and known rather than things that are imagined and hoped for. But because the waiting was done, genuinely done, not just paused or suspended, and she could feel the difference. She was standing in the kitchen in December of 1884, the boys in the next room with their father who was reading to them. William had recently decided that James's books were his books and had taken up demanding stories with the same authority he brought to all his desires, and the lamp was on the table, and the stove was going well, and the sound of Thomas's voice carrying through the wall, slow and even, reading the words of a story to 2 boys who were exactly where they should be. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of that voice, a sound she had waited so long to have in the daily, ordinary texture of her life, and which was now as natural to her as the meadowlarks in spring and the wind off the prairie at night. She thought briefly, as she sometimes did, about what she had been in the winter of 1874, a widow of 28 in a rough town, alone in the practical sense that mattered on the frontier, keeping a fire going in a neighbor's house for reasons she did not fully explain even to herself. She thought about the faith of it, the quiet, irrational, faithful daily act of going over in the cold and building the fire up and going back home again, season after season, not knowing. And she thought about Thomas Monroe's voice coming through the wall of a warm house, reading to their sons. She thought about those two things for a long moment, the then and the now, the cold and the warmth, the waiting and the having. Then she turned back to the stove and the ordinary work of a December evening in Kansas, and she was glad, fully and without reservation glad, in the deep quiet way of a woman who has lived enough to know what gladness is worth. In the spring of 1885, Letitia and Thomas planted the kitchen garden together for the first time, though she had been planting it alone or with the boys for years. It was a small thing, a Saturday morning with their hands in the cold early spring dirt, James carrying the seed packets with the officious efficiency of a child who had been assigned an important task. William crouched at the end of the row watching the seeds go in with the expression of someone filing information away. Thomas worked beside her in the easy silence of people who have shared enough space to be comfortable in quiet, turning the dirt with the same careful attention he brought to everything he built. At some point, he looked up at her across the row of turned earth and she looked back at him, and they were simply a man and a woman in a garden in the spring sun, ordinary and loved and home, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. It was everything she had ever kept a fire burning for, standing there in the April light with dirt on her hands and her family around her, and all the summers stretching ahead of them still to be lived. The kitchen garden grew all spring and summer. The tomatoes came in heavy in July and August. Letitia and Clara and Annabeth put them up in jars, dozens of jars, the shelves in the kitchen and in the store filling up with the deep red of the season's work. And Thomas carried the crates of finished jars from the kitchen to the store, with the satisfaction of a man who knows that what his hands have built is good. James helped with the labeling, his newly formed letters carefully marking each jar, and William ate tomatoes directly from the vine when no one was watching, which everyone was watching, and nobody stopped him because the pleasure of a child eating directly from a summer garden was the kind of pleasure that asked for no interference. By the fall of 1885, Thomas and Letitia Monroe had been married 9 years and had 2 healthy boys and a thriving business, and a house that had been built with care and kept with love, a house where the fire had never gone out since the October evening in 1876, when Thomas Monroe had come home from the long distance and the hard winters and walked through the door to find it warm. He sometimes told the story of it to the boys when they were old enough to hear it as a story, to the friends who asked how they had come to be together. He always told it the same way. He said that he had come home after 2.5 years away, cold and tired from the trail, and he had walked into his house and the fire was going in the stove and the kitchen was warm, and he had gone next door and knocked on Letitia's door, and she had been standing in the lamplight of her own kitchen looking at him as if she had known he would knock. He always said, I asked her how she knew I was coming back, and she always said in the telling of it, I told him I did not know. I only believed. And he would look at her when she said it, across whatever room they happened to be in, with that particular look that was only ever for her, and she would look back, and there was no distance between them anymore, no miles of trail, no winters of cold and waiting, only the fire that had never stopped burning since the day she decided to keep it lit. James Monroe grew up to work in the store beside his father, and eventually to run it, inheriting his father's practical intelligence and his mother's ability to read people. William Monroe grew up to be a schoolteacher, which surprised most people who had known him as the quiet, serious boy, and which surprised no one who had watched him file everything carefully away in that patient interior for 20 years. He taught in Caldwell first, and then in a larger town in Kansas, and he wrote letters home every week without fail. And Letitia kept those letters in the same box where she had kept Thomas's letters from the trail years, the same cedar-lined box with the brass clasp that had sat on her bedroom shelf since 1874. Thomas Monroe lived to be old in a time and place where not everyone got old, which was partly luck and partly the particular quality of a man who had learned, after too many years alone in difficult country, to take care of what he had. He kept working in the store until his 60s and then let James take the weight of it, and he spent his mornings after that in the kitchen garden, and his afternoons on the porch with a book, and the long view of the prairie that never stopped being interesting to him. He taught his grandsons, when they came, to split wood and lay fires, saying that a man should know how to keep a fire going because there was always going to be a moment when it mattered. Letitia Reed Monroe lived beside him through all of it, the building years and the full years and the slow years at the end. And she never stopped lighting the stove every morning with the particular attentiveness of a woman who knew what it meant to have a fire that burned against the cold. She grew older with the directness and the humor and the level gaze that had always characterized her, a woman who had been tested by the frontier and had not been made hard by it, which was the particular and difficult achievement of her life. In the winter of her 62nd year, sitting by the stove in the kitchen of the house where she had been coming for nearly 40 years, the house Thomas had built with his own hands and which had stood through all the seasons and the changing of the town around it, she looked at the fire in the stove with the look of someone considering a long friendship. She heard Thomas come into the kitchen behind her, a little slower now, the years in his step, but still his step, still the particular cadence of him that she would have known in a dark room, and he came to stand beside her and looked at the fire too. "Good fire," he said. "It is," she said. He sat down beside her, and they sat in the quiet of the winter morning together, with the fire going warm and steady between them and the white light of the Kansas winter outside the window. And it was ordinary and it was everything. The accumulated warmth of all the fires she had kept burning added together in a single steady flame. And it was enough, and it was theirs, and it was home.